We're talking Midway.
Midway.
At long last, and not the movie, either of them.
Yes.
Well, maybe it could come up. Who knows? Might. Who knows? Maybe there's a surprise. Maybe there's a surprise. Bo, this has been a long time coming. We were kind of talking pre-show and earlier this week. This has been one that we've been pretty excited about. This little two-parter on the Battle of Midway. So I'm really excited to dive into it. You know, it's one of those things that I feel like gets talked about so much, and our problem is we're very European-centric when it comes to World War II.
For sure.
Maybe the reason we never touched Midway before was that, you know, all of our guests were British historians talking about Britain and World War II, and
True.
you know, British fleet, save for some, you know, escort actions and working with the U.S. Navy out in the Pacific, they kind of don't pop up too much out there.
And to be fair, the Allies also were a Germany first.
And we're a Germany first podcast.
You know, so, you know, hey, I guess we were or have been, I suppose, but we're here to rectify that.
Just a little bit, just for a couple nights only. 2 nights only. It's like come see the Rat Pack live at the Sand. But I think before we get started, we'll jump in, do a little commercial break, and then we'll come right back and we'll get started with our guest and talk a bit about Midway.
You don't want to miss it. Come on back.
There, that was perfect. Good. Okay. I'll cut that part out, fix it in post, and then let's go back. Welcome back to Homebrew History. It is Bo and Joe, and we are joined tonight by the historian emeritus of the Naval War College. I would argue probably one of the finest naval historians of our time. And I actually got my start knowing Dr. Craig Symonds, knowing his work through the American Civil War, because he wrote a biography of General Patrick Cleburne, who was, of course, killed at the Battle of Franklin, where I worked for, you know, I think anybody who listens to the show knows I worked there for too long, maybe. But that's how I got started with him. And then, of course, Sam was like, oh, yeah, you know, you ought to read some of Craig's books. And I was like, oh, yeah, I guess I should.
I should.
So then I did. And turns out, excellent. So without further ado, and before I continue to embarrass the show by all of our flattery, let's go ahead and bring on Dr. Craig Symonds.
Good evening, fellas.
It's great to have you on.
Well, it's a pleasure to talk with you about, you know, I would say that there are 2 books on Midway that everyone should read. One of them is Shattered Sword by John Parshall.
Agree.
And then the other one is, oh goodness, there it is, The Battle of Midway by Craig Symonds. So.
And I agree with that too.
Have another one. Do you have any other recommendations?
On Midway in particular?
Yeah.
No, those are the 2. If you've got that, you've got it.
Those are the 2 pillars.
Yeah. I would say Ian Toll's trilogy, his coverage of Midway was really exciting.
Yeah, well, let me, in your introduction, you mentioned that the British don't pay a lot of attention to the Pacific Theater, and that's true enough. But I will tell this story, and that is that when I was teaching at the British Naval Academy in 1994-95 as a visiting professor, I was teaching a course on strategy to the young midshipmen, and I decided they needed to hear about Midway, and I told the story, and I laid it out in the decision-making process, and what ensued. And the faculty there decided it was so useful to the students who talked about it all week that they made it a permanent part of the curriculum. So if they didn't talk about it before, apparently they do now.
That's how you leave a lasting impression right there.
I hope so.
Yeah. So Bo, let's get started with our conversation, because I think what we're going to do is make this kind of a 2-part episode. We're going to do one episode right now with Dr. Symonds. We've got another one coming up with Sam Cavell. And I think the 2 will kind of balance one another pretty well. But let's talk a little bit about what's going on with the U.S. Navy say December 8th, 1941 until June 6th, 1942.
Yeah, I can do that in about 30 seconds. No, that's
Yeah, right.
no, you're absolutely right to point out that the overall strategy, which had been agreed upon even before Pearl Harbor in Washington by the American and British heads of services, was that Germany was by far the more dangerous opponent. They had a much larger GDP. They already occupied half of Europe. So the thing to do, if the United States got into this war, the thing to do was to concentrate on Germany first. And that became kind of a mantra: Germany first. We're going to do Germany first. But here's the wrinkle to that. Ernest J. King, who was the chief of naval operations, who took the title Cominch as commander in chief of the U.S. fleet, so in effect wearing two hats, Ernie King decided, if we do that, if we focus exclusively on Europe, the Japanese are going to be able to build up their defenses in the Pacific to such a point that when we do finally go after them, it'll cost more, it'll take longer. We need to do something in the Pacific, something aggressive in the Pacific, something to keep them back on their heels. So that's one factor. The other factor is that it became very clear within days of Pearl Harbor that even though the United States was eager to fulfill the Germany first plan, we simply didn't have the wherewithal to do it. We had a tiny little army, and even if we said, yes, let's invade as soon as possible, that invasion would have taken place mostly by British and Canadians. And it's a hard argument to make that you guys should go do that. So the combination of King's eagerness to get into the war in the Pacific and the inability of the English-speaking allies to do really anything serious in 1942 is what led to not just Germany first, but Germany and Japan at the same time.
That's incredibly interesting too. And obviously we kind of hinted at it a little bit because we know that the Americans had broken the Japanese codes. And that kind of gives, especially Nimitz, a forewarning that something is going to happen at Midway. And correct me if I'm wrong, but this was Midway, at least, was, in the thoughts of Yamamoto, to at least strike at the United States' aircraft carriers.
That's correct.
Which arguably had become more important than the First World War era dreadnought, but Yamamoto knew that.
Yeah.
But yeah, can you kind of elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, let me say something about the code breakers first, because I think that's a crucial point that a lot of people misunderstand in this way. It is true that a team of about between 18 and 24 dedicated junior officers and enlisted men, headed by Lieutenant Commander Joe Rochefort, labored literally around the clock in two air-conditioned basement offices beneath the district headquarters in Oahu. And hard work led them to be able to break tiny little pieces of Japanese radio messages. Now remember, there are thousands of messages coming in all the time. They have to decide, one, which ones they're going to try to break, two, which parts of them they could break, and then try to find repeated indications that maybe this means something. So I want to emphasize that when we say we broke their codes, that does not mean we're reading their mail in real time. It means we could winkle out little pieces of what it looked like they might be thinking about doing. And that made it hard for the people in Washington in particular to say, oh, well, now we know what they're going to do. And a lot of the credit goes to Nimitz, Chester Nimitz, about whom I wrote a book, so I am not entirely unprejudiced. Left a lot of that to Chester Nimitz to trust both Rochefort and Nimitz's own intelligence officer, Edwin Layton, that these little bits of information did in fact mean the Japanese were going to do this. Now he had a check on this in the Coral Sea. Remember, in May, first week of May of 1942, Layton came into Nimitz's office and says, Rochefort thinks they're going to try to capture Port Moresby. and he thinks they're going to do it with an end run around New Guinea to attack this base on the south coast of New Guinea, and they're going to do it about the first week of May, we think. Well, that puts Nimitz in a spot. He now has to decide what he's going to do about it. Nice to know what the enemy may be planning, but what do you do about it? Do you send your only surviving aircraft carrier? Remember that one is in Bremerton undergoing a refit. Two of them are off bombing Tokyo with Jimmy Doolittle. That leaves him one in the Coral Sea to try to confront maybe two, maybe three, maybe more Japanese carriers. But Nimitz decided that having advanced knowledge, if it proved true, gave him an edge. And so he committed himself to a battle in the Coral Sea. And I think that confirmed for him that when Leighton came in and said, Rochefort thinks something's going to happen, he needed to listen. And that's, of course, what happened a week later when Leighton came in and said, Rochefort thinks the Japanese are going to go after Midway.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about this man, because you already referenced him once, and you, of course, written a book on him.
Right.
But Nimitz inherits this Pacific Area Command post Pearl Harbor. Everything is a disaster. And one of the things that you pick up on in the Toll book, in your book, in Partial's book, is the man clearly had almost just ice in his veins, cool-headed, even keel, always able to just kind of see the bigger picture. So even as ships are still smoldering around him, he's able to see a little bit further on. So if you would, just a minute or two.
Yeah, I think the key here for Nimitz, and really for any successful commander, is temperament. You don't want somebody who's going to pound the table and yell at his subordinates and argue with his superiors and get in trouble with his peers. He was a guy who could, as you suggest, see the big picture, see it from 30,000 feet, and perhaps even more importantly, deal with others in a way that allowed them to figure it out as well. He didn't so much give orders as explain to them what he thought was going on, allowed them to suggest what they thought, and then maybe say, that's a good idea, we should do that. Allowed them to become participants in the decision-making process. But whether he had ice cold blood in his veins or he just kept all that inside, I'm not really sure. It's hard to say. He had those cool blue eyes, and his peers and subordinates would say, boy, when he looked at you with those eyes, you felt, yes, sir, yes, sir. So he had something about his persona that gave people confidence that they could be successful. And I think that was a force multiplier in the Pacific War. And I can imagine any number of other high commanders that we might think of, including Halsey and certainly including MacArthur, who lacked that skill, that ability, that people management characteristic that allowed Nimitz to be so successful in his job.
Mm-hmm.
I think Nimitz is one of those people that he is the man of history, and he also makes it too.
Yeah.
So Nimitz understands that there's a high probability that the Japanese are going to strike Midway. What does he do next?
Well, that's the thing. As in the Coral Sea, he believes Rochefort. He thinks he's right. And the problem is that he's lost one of his carriers in the Coral Sea. The Lexington, the biggest of his carriers, went down and was lost forever. In fact, it went into water so deep its wreckage wasn't discovered until about 7 years ago in 2018. So it's gone. And the Yorktown, which was the other carrier in the Coral Sea, had been badly damaged, and it's limping back to Pearl Harbor, trailing a 10-mile-long oil slick. The two carriers that had gone off to bomb Tokyo with Jimmy Doolittle, they're going to be available, but that gives them two. And if you count the Yorktown, maybe what, 2.5? Mm-hmm. But what Rochefort told him was the Japanese were coming with 4. Mm-hmm. So given the Europe first strategy, maybe the smart thing to do here is to let the Japanese have Midway. It's a tiny little island. It's not worth much out there in the middle of the Pacific. And he knows that the Japanese are going to have a hell of a time keeping it supplied 3,000 miles from Tokyo. American submarines could savage their supply ships. The Japanese garrison there would wither on the vine. The Americans probably take it back pretty easily. But his ace in the hole, of course, is Rochefort's advanced knowledge that this is likely to happen. It's going to happen in the first week of June. We know they're coming. We know where they're coming. So Nimitz decides, if I fix up the Yorktown real quick, patch it up, bubble gum and string, and get it out there, that gives me 3 carriers. And there's an airstrip on Midway. That's 4 airplane platforms. And they're coming with 4. That's 4 against 4. And I know they're coming.
And so, one that can't be sunk.
Pardon me, say again?
And one that can't be sunk.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, can't maneuver either. But there again, what are you going to do? So I think it's easy to underestimate the boldness of Chester Nimitz in making that decision. You know, should he lose 2, even 3 of those carriers, the whole west coast of the United States is opened up. Those carriers are the last block between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the west coast of the United States. But Nimitz decides he can do it. So he sends his carriers out early, well in advance of the Japanese approach, to an ambush position. Now, remember, the Japanese plan is that they're going to attack Midway. That will alert the Americans that there's danger, and only then will they sortie with their carriers, and the Japanese would ambush them. Instead, Nimitz turns that around, puts his carriers well north of Midway in their own ambush position, and he will pounce on the Japanese carriers when they do attack Midway. But it is and it works out. We all know, because we've read history, we all know this is going to work. But don't underestimate the boldness of making that decision. If he gets wrong, not only does he make the whole West Coast vulnerable, he certainly loses his job.
The Midway Island, they, like you said, it's a small atoll, and it's not, overly strategic, but this is the place the Japanese choose to strike. And it's always fascinating to me to learn that Midway basically sent out communications that they were out of fresh water. And and the Japanese, they see that and they're like, oh, I smell blood in the water. And they're like, no.
Yeah, there's a long backstory to that. It's kind of interesting. It has to do with the jealousy and rivalry between the intelligence services in Washington, D.C., which were run by 2 brothers, the Redmond brothers. And they were correct administratively. The way it's supposed to work was that whatever intelligence was gathered, including what Rochefort was coming up with, was supposed to be sent to Washington for them to consider, for them to think about, to make a decision, and then send operational orders back out to Nimitz or whatever operational commander was involved. Instead of that, Rochefort and Leighton, shortcut the system. Rochefort told Leighton, Leighton told Nimitz without going to Washington. So the Redmond brothers in Washington were a little annoyed by this. They said, well, how do you know? You don't really know where they're going to attack. You're just guessing. So the folks in Hypo, which is the code name for the code breaking group, said, all right, how can we prove to these skeptics that they're idiots? I know, here, we'll do this. We will send a message by subterranean cable, so it can't be intercepted, to Midway saying, send us a radio message that you're running out of fresh water, that your desalinization plants have broken down, you don't have enough drinking water, and then we'll wait. And sure enough, the code breakers intercepted a Japanese radio message saying, Midway is short of water. There you go. I got it. We figured it out. We know where they're going to strike. So it wasn't that prompted Japanese to attack, but it did confirm for the code breakers what they already knew. But it also allowed them to tell Washington, see, we were right.
That's got to be liberating, isn't it?
Yeah.
One of the things that you said about Nimitz was that he didn't have to argue with his subordinates and he didn't bicker with his superiors. He certainly wasn't a type to go before, say, the Navy board and threaten to resign if he didn't get his way, maybe like someone else.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
without spending too much time, what is kind of the Japanese mindset, the approach towards their offensive at Midway?
Well, you nailed it early on in the introduction. This is Yamamoto you're looking at on the screen here. Isoroku Yamamoto was, by all accounts, a brilliant man who was skeptical about going to war with the United States in the first place. He'd served over here for 2 tours. He knew what a dynamo the American industrial infrastructure was, and he said, we can't beat these guys, but if you want to try it, the only chance we have is to take them out on the first day. But he was vastly disappointed when Nagumo reported to him that, boy, we took out their battleships. They are wrecked. And he said, well, what about the carriers? Well, there were no carriers in Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Now, those who like conspiracy theories will tell you, see, now we knew they were coming and we hid the carriers from them. Not true at all. What happened was that the Saratoga was in Bremerton on a long planned and previously scheduled refit. The 2 active duty carriers that Husband Kimmel had, he got this war warning from Washington saying, do something to beef up the outer defenses of America because we think Japan's going to strike within the next 2 weeks. Well, what are the outer defenses? Midway and Wake. So Kimmel sends 1 carrier to each of those, along with their supports in the task force, with a Marine Air Squadron to beef up the airplanes on both Wake and Midway. Now, the one to Midway never got there, turned around after they got the news of Pearl Harbor, but the ones to Wake did get there, and they played an important role in turning back the first Japanese attack on Wake Island. So all 3 carriers were gone from Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and Yamamoto was devastated by that. And that's why and how he hatched the Midway plan, to lure those carriers out into deep water by attacking Midway. Midway's not really the target here. Midway is the bait. Attack Midway, get the Americans to send out their carriers, pounce on them, send them to the bottom, and then we own the Pacific. It's not a terrible plan, but for the code breakers.
So can you kind of tell us a little bit too about how the United States, how does Nimitz get the upper hand on the Japanese?
At Midway. Well, there are books that will tell you it was a matter of luck, providence, and so on. I think you'll look at some of the titles of the older books on Midway. Miracle at Midway, for example, is the way one author describes it. And you could take that point because of the way the timing played out. But the key point was Nimitz's decision to put his task forces, his carrier task forces, north of Midway, literally in the last place the Japanese looked for them. The Japanese sent out search planes, of course. They didn't really think it was going to be necessary. They thought they knew where the carriers were. They were in Pearl Harbor. No, they weren't. But as it happened, the Japanese did not sight either of the 2 carriers under Spruance's command at all. They did spot the Yorktown, but only after they had hit Midway with their first strike. So that puts Nagumo in a tough spot. Here's what he's got to think about. I bombed Midway. My bomber commander tells me I need a second strike. So I could bring up my second strike with high explosive bombs and send them out, then recover the planes coming back from Midway, rearm them with armor-piercing weaponry so I can attack that carrier north of me. But that's only with half of my force. Maybe what I should do is recover the planes, rearm everybody, and send off a massive strike against this carrier and get the job done. Remember, getting the carriers, more than getting Midway, is the most important objective here. So while Nagumo is trying to figure out the timing of this, the American planes have already launched from their carriers and are heading toward him. And there they are. Yeah.
And we're talking about a mix of Army and Navy, because you've got Army planes coming up off of Midway. You've got fighters and dive bombers and torpedo bombers, and you've got all this kind of mix of aircraft. And this is before we've really unlocked the key to dogfighting with the Japanese. So what's the casualties look like? What's the action look like?
Yeah, actually, these are two separate attacks. The early attack, the one that's launched from Midway airstrip, that's the melange of Vindicators and B-17s and all sorts of other planes. I mean, as you say, it's a mishmash. There's Army, there's Navy, there's all Marine Corps, and they're not really cooperating. And they attack. They find the Japanese carriers and they attack them, and they're completely unsuccessful. They don't land a glove on them, and they're all, let's say 90%. You can check that number. That may not be exactly accurate, but the vast majority of them are lost in this attack. And the Japanese admiral, by now, Nagumo's thinking, if this is the best the Americans can do, I've got nothing to worry about.
Easy.
So that first strike is a non-starter. It doesn't go anywhere. But it's the second strike, the one that comes from the carriers, that is most effective. And here's another place where luck and circumstance play a role. The planes from the Hornet, which is commanded by Mark Pete Mitcher, the planes from the Hornet do not fly to the coordinates that had been reported by the scout planes. Mitcher has convinced himself that the Japanese are operating in two groups, as the Americans are, by the way, that there are two carriers at the coordinates reported and two more 80 to 100 miles behind them. And he says, I'm going to get those two carriers. So instead of ordering them to fly to the southwest, he orders them to fly west. And they fly right out of the battle. They never see the Japanese. They never drop a bomb. They never release a torpedo. They never fire a shot. And they come back with all their ordnance intact. So for all the work that Nimitz did to get three carriers out there, there are really only two involved in this attack. And that's the Enterprise and the Yorktown, because the Hornet Air Group has flown itself out of the battle.
And those are under Spruance?
The two carriers that are under Spruance are the Enterprise and the Hornet. And Spruance is the guy who decides, overruling his air boss, by the way, that we need to hit them early. And he orders the planes to go now. Don't wait. Don't group up. Go. But it's Mitcher on the Hornet who, instead of going in that direction, sends his air group under a Commander Stansfield Ring off to the west in what history has labeled the flight to nowhere.
Sure. So after this first wave, obviously, like you said, it's a non-starter. When the Japanese realize, or I guess let me ask, when do the Japanese realize that they're in trouble?
Well, that's a great question, because after that first failed attack, the second attack comes from a wayward torpedo squadron from the Hornet. This is a guy named Jack Waldron, who commanded the 15 planes of Torpedo 8, who argued with Ring, his air group commander, and said, I'm not going that way. That's the wrong way. I'm going this way. He committed mutiny. Let's call it what it was. And he flew beeline toward the Japanese carriers. And in fact, all four carriers were operating together. Mitcher was just wrong. So the first American planes from the carriers to get there are these 15 torpedo bombers coming in without fighter protection, without support from dive bombers, all by themselves, attacking this gigantic Japanese formation. And as you might expect, all 15 planes are shot down. The contribution he makes, and it's not on purpose. He didn't say, I will sacrifice myself to do this. But the inadvertent contribution that he makes is that by attacking low, as torpedo planes have to do, he drew the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the CAP, down from 15,000 feet to about 500 feet in order to shoot down all those planes. And what that meant was that about 10, 15 minutes later, when the dive bombers arrived from the Enterprise at 15,000 feet, there's no combat air patrol up there. so they can line up on the ships, take their time, and lay those bombs right on the flight deck. And in the next 5 minutes, the course of the Second World War in the Pacific was flipped.
See, now, Bo, that's what I would call a turning point.
Yes, it is definitely a turning point.
Yeah.
We have this long running argument that I am of the opinion that there is no such thing as a turning point. Except this. I'll give this.
All right. We got you. Way to go, Joe. There you go. I won one.
I mean, it just blows my mind that in 5 minutes time, the might of the Japanese Imperial Navy is in shambles. And the Japanese are never able to, recover from this.
Well, not completely. No, they do win arguably. They win the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands during the Guadalcanal campaign. Their fighters are still excellent, but here's the problem. I mean, their pilots are still excellent, but the problem is instead of bringing them back to Japan to educate the next group of future pilots, they keep them on the front line, and eventually they just lose so many they're no longer competitive. The Americans do the opposite. And this, again, is one of the things Nimitz did. He took 70 pilots, veterans of both Coral Sea and Midway, and sent them back to the United States to be air instructors. They instruct the next generation of pilots so that by the time 1943 comes around, not only do we have more pilots, we have more experienced pilots, we have better pilots, and quite frankly, by now, we have better airplanes.
One of the things that I picked up on, and I know, Bo, we talked about this way back in the old grad school days, when we did the book on the code breakers and everything else, and we eventually got to talking about the fighting and everything that goes on, is that there's just immense casualties suffered by the torpedo bombers as they go in, right? And it just seems like it's such a waste because they know that their aircraft are not maybe necessarily the fastest and maybe necessarily the most well armed and able to be exposed for such a prolonged period.
That's all fair, and yet of course there weren't any pilots who said, I'm not doing that.
Right.
All of these people raised their hand and said, let me do it, including in particular Gene Lindsay, who had suffered a horrible accident just the day before and whose back was almost literally broken. They had to lower him into his cockpit, but he wasn't going to miss this. What they knew was that the torpedo is the most effective ship killer. Now, in this battle, it's the dive bombers that do it. The dive bombers, because there were so many of them, and they landed those bombs in just the right places at just the right time to create several secondary explosions inside the hangar deck. But a torpedo is a ship killer. And if you could put a torpedo into a capital ship, you had a better chance of sinking it than you did with even a 1,000-pound bomb. The problem is, to do that, you had to come in at about 100 feet. So you're down there very low and visible and vulnerable. You had to drop that torpedo at a slow speed, because if you were going too fast, the impact of the torpedo on the water would set off the triggering mechanism. So you're coming in low and slow. It's almost like saying, shoot me. And so, yes, not only did all 15 planes of Torpedo 8 were lost in this battle, so too were most of the torpedo planes from the other two carriers, because they had to come in low, they had to come in slow. Of all of them, only 4 survived to get back to the carriers.
And I know this is a strange way to go from that question to then saying this, but I'm going to borrow from our friends James Holland and Al Murray, and they talk about the steel, not flesh approach. And that's just how the Allies win the war: steel, not flesh. Use technology over men's lives. All of that makes sense. And then you contrast that maybe with the Japanese carrier force, because one of the things that I've picked up along the last couple of weeks in preparation for this is, while American crews practiced fire suppression techniques and fire and damage control techniques, the Japanese focused more on rearmament and trying to be as speedy and as efficient with that as possible. They abandoned all of the practices in the middle of this firefight. And while the American carriers may be being hit and maybe being attacked, and there could be, damage done to the fuel tanks and everything, they're able to isolate that by and large,
Yeah.
and they're able to keep the ships moving and launching and reclaiming aircraft. And then the Japanese, who leave an entire hangar deck full of explosive armed ordnance, fuel lines completely still full, while the American practices to drain them as quick as possible.
Yeah, there are two things here. One is the timing, and we mentioned this earlier, that Nagumo's decision to strike the planes that were on the flight deck down to the hangar deck, rearm, refuel, shift over the ordnance, take off the explosive bombs, put on the armor-piercing bombs, and they don't have time to lower the explosive bombs back down to the magazine, so they're just on racks against the wall. So this is an accident waiting to happen. That's part of it. But I think you touch on what is really a bigger part of the issue, and you're absolutely right. The Japanese culturally, and particularly the Japanese Army and Navy, had a view that it was a warrior's job to kill the other guy. It's not a warrior's job to protect yourself. It's not a warrior's job to put self-sealing fuel tanks on your airplane. It's not a warrior's job to put armor around the cockpit. It's not a warrior's job even to have a parachute, because that assumes you're going to need it. What we want is for you to think not about how to save yourself. We want you to think about how to kill the other guy. Well, of course, on the American side, they spend a lot of time on damage control, on self-sealing fuel tanks, armored cockpits. Of course, each pilot not only has a parachute, he has a little raft to get into if he's forced to abandon the aircraft. And I think that cultural view, what is a warrior's job? To kill the other guy or make sure? One of the key things you picked up on, Joe, is that I think there's a dramatic difference in the culture of the two sides. The warrior culture in Japan held that it was a warrior's job to kill his opponent, not to worry about defending himself. Why would he need armor around his cockpit? Why would he need a parachute, for example? He's not going to need that. Make the other guy use his parachute. And that mindset contributed to heavy losses on the Japanese side early on in the war in 1942 and 1943. When they lost an airplane, they usually lost the air crew as well. On the American side, if we lost an airplane, 95% of the time, a destroyer would come out and pick up the air crew. So that allowed the Americans to have a longer role in this war than the Japanese did.
Funnily enough, we one of the very first episodes, if not the first episode of Homebrew History, we had a guy on that's a fellow colleague of Joey and I's, and he gives a really good lecture titled Bushido Abandoned, and talking about the development of, the sort of warrior culture and the abandonment of the ways of old, the ways of the samurai, and how, militarism and nationalism really helped fuel this dark era of Japanese history. But I do have this really big question here, and I think this is a perfect way to kind of wind down just a little bit here. How exactly does the Japanese high command deal with the loss at Midway?
Well, to get all you need to know about the Japanese role in the Battle of Midway, you need to read the book by John Parshall and Tully about Shattered Sword, because they really cover this stuff great. But the short version is that, of course, the Japanese tried to keep this as quiet as possible. They didn't want the public to know. The Navy didn't want the Army to know. There was such a rivalry between the Imperial Army and the Imperial Navy that they were almost allies rather than representing a single country. They finally did acknowledge some losses, although not the size of the losses in the Battle of Midway. So they tried to downplay it. They really thought they could recover and achieve what they wanted. Remember that their goal is not really to defeat the United States the way we would think about defeating another country, compel their submission. What they hoped would happen was that when the Americans tried to fight their way back across the Pacific, they would take such horrible losses in doing so that at some point, 1943, 44, 45, 46, 47, at some point, the Japanese would say, the Americans would say, oh my gosh, this costs too much, it's too expensive, we've run out of patience, I've missed the latest movie. Let's negotiate. And in that negotiation, the Japanese would be allowed to keep most of what they'd conquered in 1942. That was their plan. And it really shows their misunderstanding of America as much as it does American misunderstanding of the Japanese.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Bo, I think you know what time it is.
Yes.
It is about.
It is that time.
It is about that time. How about we wrong one.
There we go.
Here we go.
Okay, so Dr. Symonds, what Boohickey history is? It is something that every historian hates, right? It's bad history. It's bad takes. It is bad interpretations. It is something that is absolutely ridiculous. It's Boohickey. It's rubbish. There's something that people get wrong about the Battle of Midway, whether it be a myth, whether it be a misinterpretation. What is something about the Battle of Midway that you want to debunk or set the record straight?
Well, it's not completely Boohickey, but I think the idea that we won the Battle of Midway completely because of luck. We were just lucky. It was a miracle at Midway. My argument that I make in my book is that at each decisive turning point in that battle, someone made a decision. Nimitz had to decide to trust his code breakers and send that fleet out to the north. That Spruance had to overrule his air boss and send those bombers out early. Wade McCluskey had to decide, well, there's nobody here at the coordinates I was given. I'll just go back. No, he was going to conduct a search. And the product of that search was finding the enemy. So, yes, it seems providential, but I think the key is appreciating and understanding the hard decisions made by the commanders at the scene, by the seat of their pants, that led to the final American success. That would be the biggest thing.
That's a great point. And now there is this little part of the show. We have this little tradition. We started all the way back very beginning. What is in your cup? So we're just going to go around and talk about what we have in the old flasks tonight.
Oh, yeah. Well, you mentioned in one of your notes to me that you were interested in the cocktail that Chester Nimitz used to have before dinner every night. I have the recipe, which I'm willing to share with you, which is, if you are ready, are your listeners ready? Have you got a pencil, you guys? So here it comes. You take a highball glass, like this one. You put a sugar cube in the bottom of it, and you put 2 drops of Angostura bitters on the sugar cube. Then you put in just enough hot water to melt the sugar. Then you fill the glass with crushed ice, and you put in 2 jiggers of bourbon and top it with 1 jigger of rum. Drink.
He's a Navy man. What can you say?
That is a powerful cocktail, my friend. I've had several of them, and I did not have one before this conversation because I'd be out of my chair. But if you're not going to drive, if you're staying home, if you just want a leisurely evening, it goes down smoothly. I recommend it. Nimitz called it a sink pack.
The sink pack. That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nice.
Drink up me hearties, yo-ho.
Yo-ho.
Bo, you'll be proud of me.
Yes.
Go ahead. Ask me what's in my cup.
What is in your cup?
For the first time in a very long time, a little sip of Pusser's Navy rum.
There you go.
I thought, you know what? Let's go with the theme. So There it is.
Yep.
There you go.
Well, how about yourself, Al?
I am actually drinking an Italian white wine, Castillo del Poggio.
Oh, sure. Put us down. We lower class bourgeois. While you have.
My nose is up. My nose is up, folks. Yeah.
Bravo. Well done. Well, I'm glad one of us has taste.
It took a little bit.
Yeah.
The year,
yeah.
So. All right.
I tell you what, my next drink is this, Nimitz cocktail. I've got it written down, and I'm ordering everything right now.
You'll like it. It's good, but don't drive after. or for that matter, try to walk.
Always drink responsibly. There's the little safety picture
There you go.
All right.
Again, folks, the book is The Battle of Midway by Dr. Craig Symonds, and then the other one is Shattered Sword by John Parshall and Anthony Tully.
Yeah.
Be sure to have those on your shelf. Dr. Simon, any last final thoughts for us?
Oh, from me?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, I'll take the opportunity to flog my newest book. How's that?
Please
There
do.
you go.
One of the things I wanted to do after I finished the Nimitz book was write about the junior officers who actually fought the war. And so I focused on the Naval Academy class of 1940. It's kind of a band of brothers go to sea approach. I follow these guys from their arrival at the Naval Academy in the summer of 1936, follow them through their academy years, and then into the war through the surrender on the deck of the Missouri in 1945. So this is the book. Annapolis Goes to War, the Naval Academy class of 1940, and its trial by fire in World War II. It's just out. It's out this month, in fact.
Wow.
So
there we go.
You heard it here first.
Yeah, that's right.
There's a good little release for everyone.
So if you're not careful, we're going to have you back on to talk about that book now.
No, that would work. That would work.
We can do that. We can set that up.
Okay. All right.
But Bo, I think this gets us for the first little filler. Stick around. There is another part to this little double header on Midway, and we'll be back with more of that. And remember, if you are a listener, and by being a listener, you can head over to the Buy Me a Coffee page, drop down in the comments section there. And for $5 a month, when we do a series, you get the whole thing all at once, and you get a little bit of advanced access as well, plus some kind of freebies that Bo and I throw your way every now and again. So be a listener, help us, help the show, keep things running. You know, who knew that podcasting costs money and you barely ever come out on top? But here we are. Dr. Symonds, again, a pleasure. Bo, as always, a joy. Till next time, folks. Cheers.
We'll see you next time.
Okay. Night.